Now that we've seen some examples of revenue management in other industries, let's take a look at the airlines. The airlines are, of course, the place where modern revenue management techniques were developed and where revenue management is practiced most extensively today. And revenue management started to really come into its own in the airline industry back in the 1970s prior to deregulation. So in the United States, prior to 1979, when the airline industry was deregulated, airlines did not really have much control over the routes that they flew, the schedules they operated, or the fares that they charged. There was a government agency called the Civil Aeronautics Board. Let's write that down. The Civil Aeronautics Board. And the Civil Aeronautics Board, or CAB Board, was the agency that had oversight over the airline industry. So when the airlines wanted a price change, a fare increase, they needed to provide economic justification to the CAB. And that justification was usually in the form of cost increases. So if the airline's costs were increasing and they needed to raise the fare to cover those costs, they would go to the CAB, provide some justification of the cost increase, and the CAB would approve a fare based on some cost plus pricing. Now you can imagine that that type of environment does not provide a lot of incentives for cost control. Consider that the routes and schedules were regulated as well as the fares, so there were really pretty high barriers to entry, and it was easy for airlines to pass along price increases to their customers. So rather than focus on cost control, when their costs went up, they simply raised the fare and still made a profit. I'm sure there was some elasticity in the market, but basically there wasn't much competition, so they were able to pass those fare increases along pretty easily. Well, in the late 60s and early 1970s, the CAB started getting pressure from consumer groups for more discount fares. So prior to that, there was more than one fare available on an airplane, but there might have been maybe two fares. So the full fare and some advanced purchase excursion fare. But basically, the average price to travel on an airline in those days was rather high, and that priced a lot of people out of the market. So the industry was serving part of the population, but not the full population. And the CAB responded to this, and they allowed charter airlines to come in and provide some competition to the existing airlines, so charter airlines. And what they allowed the charters to do that really enabled their business model was they allowed the charters to enter existing markets but charge lower fares than the airlines that were already serving those markets. So let's just take an example. Let's say there was a route, let's choose a different color here. Let's say there was a route from New York, JFK to Miami. And the existing price prior to the charters was, let's just say it's $150. So the airlines are charging $150. That price is based on cost price pricing, so they're making money at that fare. Then the charter carriers come in, and they come in at, let's say, $75 to fly the same route. Now, the charter service was not as reliable as the full-service airlines. They were not allowed to provide regularly scheduled service. They would provide it maybe one day a week, or they would wait until they got enough bookings and then operate the charter. It was not comparable to the full-service carriers, but it was at a much lower rate. Well, you can imagine the traveling public responded pretty favorably to this. The folks who were traveling at $150 on the scheduled airlines some of those people started flying the charter airlines at $75. And the charter airlines, while $75 is a much lower fare than what the full service airlines were getting, they came in with a much lower cost structure. Not only were they new and didn't have the history of the cost increases that the airlines had experienced, but running a charter operation is much less expensive than running a full service airline. You don't, your staffing is much cheaper. You don't need as many facilities. You don't have to operate a schedule if you don't have enough customers to guarantee that the flight is going to be profitable. So they came in at a lower fare and were profitable at that lower fare, while the airlines would never be able to compete at that fare and make money. Well, this provided a real challenge for the airlines. They could do two things. They could either try to reduce their costs to match the charter carriers and then match their fare and make money at those costs. Well, that was impractical. Certainly the costs in the industry had been developing for a number of years. Plus, as I said, operating a full service carrier is more expensive than a charter carrier. If they didn't address costs and they just lowered their fare to regain the market share that they had lost to the charter carriers, they would lose money because their average cost, the cost on average of providing every seat on the airplane, was greater than the fare that the charters were charging. So even though they might be able to, let's say they could fill every seat on the airplane, they would still be losing money because the fare was not covering the average cost. So let's take a look at an example. Let's put some numbers on the board here and see what they look like. I've already gone ahead and created an example here because I wanted to make sure that it worked. Let's say we have some cost information and some fare information for both the airline and the charter. So on the top we have our costs, on the lower portion here we have our revenue, and then we're going to calculate the profit for each one of these organizations. And we're going to say that this is these are in different time periods. So let's look at these separately. Let's say the airline's average cost for providing the seats on the airplane is $80 per seat. So they have, for example, they have 200 seats on the airplane. Each seat costs them on average $80 to provide or produce. So the total cost of operating a flight, let's use our example from JFK to Miami, $80 on average times 200 seats is $16,000. So the airline is going to, it's going to cost them $16,000 to operate that flight from JFK to Miami. So of course they're going to price their product so that they can make money and cover those costs. So let's take an example fare on the bottom here. So let's say the airline was, they got approval to charge $150. Well, they couldn't expect to sell all their seats. You know, planes don't generally go out full. So let's say they were only able to sell 150 of the 200 seats on the airplane. Well, the revenue they would get from those 150 seats would be 150 times the $150 they're getting for each seat. So the total revenue would be $22,500. Subtract the total cost from the total revenue, and the airline is making $6,500 profit on that flight, selling 3/4 of the seats. So we would say that's a 75% load factor. Well, let's take a look at the charter's operation. Well, the charter has lower costs, so let's say their cost is $50 per seat. Same airplane. Let's, to make the math work easily, we're going to assume the same size airplane. 200 seats, so $50 per seat times 200 is $10,000. So the charter will incur a $10,000 cost to fly the same route. Where they're going to charge a much lower fare. So at $75, if they sell the same number of seats that the airline sold, the 75% load factor, they would produce $11,250 in revenue, subtract the $10,000 of cost from that revenue, and they're making $1,250. Now, of course, these two situations don't coexist. Once the charter airline came in, the the full service airline was no longer able to keep this scenario, right? Because if they continued to charge this fare, they would not sell as many seats as they did before. For example, let's say we're going to choose a different color here. I don't know, blue, darker blue. Let me erase this. So let's say if the charter airline comes in and charges $75 and steals some of the market share from the existing airline, the airline responds by keeping their fare the same. Let's say the first thing they do is they just keep their fare at $150. Well, they're not going to be able to keep all 150 customers. Let's erase that and say that the new number of customers that they could retain is 100. So they're only going to keep 100 customers. So now their revenue is going to go down to $15,000. 15,000, and at $15,000 in revenue and $16,000 in costs, now they are losing how much? $1,000. So by doing nothing, the airline is going to lose money. Well, the other thing they could do is match the fare. So let's say they match the fare. So instead of keeping it $75, at $150, they lower their fare to $75 to match the charter. So let's say 75. And now they actually, well, let's say they fill the plane. So they've lowered their fare. At $150, they were getting 150 seats. 75, let's say the public really responds to that and they fill the plane. Well, $75 times 200 is $15,000. So even if they fill the plane, they're going to still incur a loss of $1,000. And that makes sense, right? Because their average cost is $80. If the fare they're charging is lower than their average cost, they're going to lose money on every seat that they sell. So this presented a real quandary for the airlines. How could they compete in this environment? They couldn't match the charter's costs, and if they didn't match the fare, they wouldn't get enough volume to make money on the flight. They would lose market share to the charters. Well, the managers at American Airlines realized something. And they realized that while the average cost for the airline was $80, which was above the fare that the charters were charging, the marginal cost was actually close to zero. So let's write that down, the marginal cost. And if you remember from economics, I have a little trouble with my scroll here. Let's see. If you remember from our economics, economists like to say that all decisions are made at the margin. So think about what the American Airlines managers were saying. The average cost of providing a seat is, what did we say, $80. So if you have a total cost of $16,000 for operating a flight, and there are 200 seats on that airplane, the average cost is $80 per seat. And the $75 fare, even if you sold 200 seats at $75, it would not cover the total cost of the airplane. But think about what they're saying about marginal costs. For each additional seat that they provide, so let's say they sell 100 of those 200 seats, providing the next seat, the marginal cost, the additional cost of providing the next seat is close to zero, because most of the costs that go into operating the airplane are incurred regardless of how many customers fly on that airplane, right? The crew, the pilots, the flight attendants, the ground crew, the terminal, the fuel on the airplane, all of those costs are incurred regardless of how many customers are traveling on the airplane. So if American Airlines could figure out a way of continuing to charge $150 for those customers who were willing to pay $150, albeit it'll be fewer customers than they were getting before. But if they could retain those customers and then charge $75 only on the seats that would have otherwise gone out empty, they could compare that $75 to the marginal cost of zero. So now the fare is $75 and the marginal cost is zero, and they would be making additional profit on this flight at those $75 fares, given that those seats were going to go out empty anyway. So the trick is they now have two fares on the airplane: the $150 fare for the customers who are willing to pay that, and the $75 fare for those seats that would have gone out empty anyway, where the marginal cost was zero. And in the next video, we'll take a look at an example of how they accomplish that.